Welcome to UFO Classified with Erica Lukes.
So my skeptical mind, and that's just who I am, my skeptical mind goes to, well, yeah, of course, you've got this guy over here that's logical and reasonable, and you got this guy over here that's wearing a tinfoil hat. Of course the tinfoil hat guy's going to see a lot of stuff, right? He's like imagining it, or he's watched one too many sci-fi movies.
But it's used to help us frame hypotheses for UFO propulsion, power, stealth, weaponry.
Everything that we experience is very positive.
Sometimes the field of ufology has a short memory span.
We didn't know anything about the $22 million back then. We just kind of thought, well, this is, and I think that was the reason why they were looking for military-type people, because in the military, you work with whatever you got, no matter what the situation is. You just kind of adapt and overcome.
Welcome, my friends, to UFO Classified. Again, it's always a wonderful Friday evening when I get to hang out with all of you, to see my friends in chat, and to get messages from people from all over the world. I am really, really grateful that this show has gained so much traction and people are starting to understand there is a need for the truth. What we're getting from the bringers of disclosure is just simply utter nonsense, and it is unfortunately weighing down the subject when we should be trying to find real answers. But first, we have to go through the personalities, look at their objectives, and look at what they've contributed or not over the decades, and then we can perhaps get to the truth. My guest this evening is somebody who has done that. I have a lot of respect for him, and I would recommend his blog, which I will give you information about. I will be introducing him in a moment, but first I want to tell you a little bit about my adventures the past few days. I was fortunate enough to have Alice Druffel and her boyfriend here. We went on a grand adventure, and we went up to Skinwalker Ranch and the surrounding area, and I did a little bit of research, well, quite a bit, and things are coming together even more now than they ever have been, and I am very certain that there is absolutely nothing to do with UFOs at Skinwalker Ranch. And when you take a look at the surrounding areas, and you see the oil rigs here, there. You look at the business connections in the community. You look at the current ownership or the people involved with the ownership, and you look at what they're doing in the community and with business, oil and so forth, and you get a pretty clear picture of how things are rolling out. And I am on that. It was also very interesting and saddening, shocking for me to be at the cemetery with not only Charles Wynn, whose granddaughter was on my show last week talking about his experience living next to the ranch, but also to see the Junior Hicks, to see his grave and see the small plaque that was above his grave. He passed away a couple months ago, but I'm hoping that he will have a big, beautiful gravestone to commemorate him. He's such a wonderful man. I'm sure that will come. But in the cemetery, I was shocked at the number of stillborns. And I was just looking at a little teeny segment, not only stillborns, but there were, unfortunately, very tragically, a lot of young people in the community who had passed. And you have to look a little bit further into that. And I remember a few years back, there was a really great article in Rolling Stone about the stillbirths in the Vernal area, which is right by the ranch. And that is something definitely I would recommend reading, and start to look at the history of the area and the what the industry is and all of these things. And then you see a bigger picture here. And I am on top of that. I have a lot of help, and I will get to the bottom. But whatever you think, Skinwalker Ranch is most certainly not what anybody is telling you that has anything to do with TV shows or Bigelow's team. So anyway, on that note, I am here with someone, Jack Brewer to be exact, who I remember, and I've talked about this on past shows, but it's been funny because I first, when I got into this publicly, I was starry-eyed and thought everybody was doing this and we're all in this together, and I'd made so many cool, I learned so many things, and then there was Jack Brewer, or Robert Schaefer, or some of these people, and I thought, are you kidding me? You're just naughty. And, now that I'm looking, because he was so, critical of things. And now that I step back and I look at why they're critical, the experiences they've had, then I can say I am grateful to be friends with Jack Brewer and to have him on my show, because we need that balance. We need people to push us back from the edge and say, wait a minute, you need to look logically at A, B, C, and D, and then form a picture, with all the pieces. And so, Jack, I just want to say I'm a big fan of yours, and I'm glad that I can bounce things off of you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that a lot. And I think virtually all of us have been there, that if we were interested in this in the first place, then I think we were pretty starry-eyed. I certainly can say that about myself. And we should be allowed the room to grow and learn as we conduct research. And I appreciate you too, and thanks for having me on.
No, it's going to be a great show. It'll be a lot of fun, and we know that there are a ton of things happening in the quote-unquote UFO community, and the big TTSA and yada yada, all this stuff that really, in my opinion, is just a distraction. And I'm sure, and I know that there are people doing a lot of work to see what's going on behind the scenes, which will be interesting to see how that rolls out. But what have you been focusing on as of late?
I've got a few irons in the fire. Thanks for asking. The Committee on Aerial Phenomena, which you're becoming increasingly well informed about yourself. And
yes,
go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that's been a really interesting thing for me to look through, especially with my latest the acquisition of the Ann Druffel files, because she was involved in NICAP, and now looking at all the things that she has, it's just mind-blowing.
Yeah, I bet. And one of the things that initially interested me was, I've long had this interest of the overlapping of the intelligence community and UFO investigators. So there's a lot of that. So that's what I was first looking at. And then the more I look, the more it resembles things that are happening today with TTSA. And you have the high-profile military figures and intelligence figures that are ringing the disclosure bells, and there's just a lot of similarities. And Erica, I'll tell the listeners that Erica helped facilitate my correspondence with some former NICAP people. She helped me with emails, so she saw the copies of some of these emails, and there's a number of different views on what people think happened. And interestingly, I think they're all correct at different times. There was CIA involvement in NICAP, and it didn't really matter sometimes. And I think other times it might have mattered, or at least there's a story there about what the intentions were and what the purpose was. And we definitely need to get some of this stuff out and look at it, because reviewing the past tells us more about what we might be looking at today too, I think.
You hit it right on the head, and I think that's really, really critical, because, as you noticed, the patterns are repeating. It's almost the same playbook. Now you just have more bells and whistles because technology's changed and different things, and we have a greater, we can reach more people. But yeah, when you look at NICAP and you compare it to TTSA or to some of the goings-ons now, it's just the similarities are quite interesting. And I want you to talk a little bit about what you're learning specifically with regard to NICAP and the intelligence community, that involvement.
Sure. Well, early on, there were CIA assets involved in NICAP, and some of it was overt and some of it was not. The former director of Central Intelligence, the initial director, Admiral Hillenkoetter, obviously, he was CIA, and he sat on the board of governors. And some of the people I talked to and some of the records I look at indicate he was pretty hands off, and I don't know how much he was even particularly interested in it, or maybe he did have some interest because people like James Carrion, who you've done good interviews with, has linked Hillenkoetter to some odd UFO goings-ons. But one thing we can draw from that is whatever the CIA was doing, it was pretty overt if they put the former DCI right on the board of governors. So that's kind of an interesting thing. While there were some other possible assets, likely assets, one certainly was a CIA asset, that it was not known at the time, but he didn't spend much time with the organization. It was just during the first couple of months. And so there's some inferences we can get from some FOIA releases. The FBI has been helpful with information for me that I'll be writing about, and we can get some inferences. Another person that was really helpful is Barry Greenwood. He shared with me, oh my gosh, I don't know, maybe 36 different files that must have had, I'd estimate, 1,000 pages of NICAP documents and notes and letters and newspaper clippings and whatnot that I've been going through. And I received that after I was well on my way to thinking I already had enough information to make a significant or reasonable contribution to the topic. So it's been quite a process to parse through this and see what I think is relevant and try to synthesize it into a coherent narrative and try to make sure that I stay objective and accurately identify an inference as compared to just saying here's something that I think happened. And there's some interesting stories in there for sure. I'm projecting to have this completed. I'm looking at spring. I'm hoping to have it done sometime early next year.
That is fantastic, and let me know how I can be of help with you in that regard, because I like I said, with the Ann Druffel files and her involvement with NICAP, it's just been very eye-opening to me, and it's also confirmed some of the things that I've been investigating and over the years. And it really is, NICAP was a one of a kind. And there were, like you say, a lot of people involved in the intelligence agencies that were on the board of directors and were involved. And, according to my friend Gordon Lohr, eventually took down the organization, people like Stuart Nixon. And it is interesting to read some of the correspondence with Stuart Nixon and see how he really poo-pooed the subject and tried to turn people off. Oh, we've got nothing to see here, go away. So I love reading all of this, and it is critical for us to understand the history of this if we want to move forward.
Yeah, and it is interesting. I ordered Mr. Lohr's book, and then when I compare that with the files that Mr. Greenwood gave me, and then when I compare that, like with the interview clips that you've been posting, I've been listening to your show for weeks now, and we get to hear Mr. Hall's statements to Ms. Druffel about his thoughts on the infiltration of NICAP, and then we can kind of put all this together in a narrative. Does show us some interesting things when we kind of pull it all together, at least as best I can. And it's really fascinating. Even towards the latter stages, there, and you and I have talked about this a bit before, we did have a CIA operative, Joseph Bryan, that was not known at the time. was a relatively high-level character. He ran an entire psychological warfare division that the more I've learned about it, the more significant it seems to have been. And he was quite well connected in the agency and in social circles. And so there's a lot of questions there as to I suppose, as I've, suggested on my blog, I suppose it's possible that someone that was a psychological warfare specialist for a living was just interested as a hobby in UFOs. I mean, I can't say unequivocally not, but that's a pretty odd chain of events there. And we can look at the divisions he and his associates worked in, and what the CIA was focusing on, and what they were interested in during that point in time in history. And it does, to me, it's interesting, and I thought was worth writing about, putting some material together and saying, wow, here's what we unequivocally can say happened, whatever it may or may not mean.
And I think that is so cool because, I mean, to me, when I see somebody like John Alexander, who's the, papa of psychological warfare and non-lethal weapons, you do wonder, okay, why is he in the UFO subject? And you said it, it could be just that you've got this passion for it, but I don't think so, because you're starting to see a pattern, and you see people that have immersed themselves decade after decade in ufology, who are working on different things like Put Off and Kit Green, and you look at the fact that they've received funding from Gottlieb, and Gottlieb was the father of MK Ultra, which is very, very disturbing. And yet nobody in ufology even brings that up. It doesn't raise an alarm bell, which it should. And then you look at their work, and they've really contributed nothing but added more confusion to the subject at the end of the day.
Yeah, they really do. And one of the big points, whether we're talking about the 50s or the 60s or John Alexander or Luis Elizondo and Christopher Mellon, I think it's important to bear in mind that of all people, these guys should know the importance of bringing the goods if you've got a story. If you got a story about Skinwalker Ranch, if you got something to say about what you saw when you were in the service, if you got a story about what was going on at the Pentagon, of all people, intelligence professionals should know how important it is to show documentation. So that's one point. Then a second point is, if you're coming into the UFO genre that has a well-documented history of charlatans and lies and half-baked stories, you should know that's where you're coming, and that people should really lean towards skepticism. If anything, they should be all the more vigilant about demanding evidence in support of a claim. So that's another point. So then when you put all of this together, and you see that they come into these UFO conferences and radio interviews with a bunch of ambiguous statements and platitudes, it's just reasonable to question their sincerity, or at best their competence, that of all people, they should know how important it is to have documented, verifiable evidence available for public review when they come into this genre. And then for them to act like some 17-year-old at the liquor store that says they don't have their ID on them, like
That's classic.
I mean, It never occurred to me till I got here. You know, I drove all the way up here and thought, wow, they might ask me for some evidence, you know.
But yet they rely because they're so, I mean, in this community, there are a lot of good people, but there are people that are so willing just to believe for the sake of believing that it's like, I mean, they say things and it's like, oh, okay, well, guess what? Eric Davis was talking to me and this must be true. And, it's the most asinine story that you could even put forward. And it's like, when did we go from believing in all of these crazy, crazy things to looking at the facts? And I think, over the past few days, I've had, even just being up at Skinwalker Ranch, it's like, I was just sitting there, and I was sitting on a particular portion right outside of the fence line where I had a very interesting experience myself. And I mean, I just broke down in tears because I feel like in a lot of ways, the people who've been involved with Skinwalker Ranch have been raped. And that is, it's just, it is such a despicable thing what's going on. And it's like, when did we lose our common sense to think that there's one place on the planet where things are taking place, but yet we have airlines flying constantly over this location, but supposedly it's a threat. We've got radiation, but nothing's being locked down. And, that's all of these questions. It's like, when do you let common sense, because you want to believe in shape-shifting demonic things? When do we let reality sink in for a second?
Yeah, we do make ourselves easy targets because we want information so badly collectively. I mean, us as a community, and many of us have experienced something that we interpret as unusual and we think has something to do with some type of unknown phenomena. And some of these people are really good at presenting themselves. They're charismatic, they're friendly, they're knowledgeable, they seem like pleasant people, and they're really pros at whatever it is they're doing. And I've kind of come to the decision that I don't have to identify what they're doing. I just keep having to take note, did they present evidence that supports their claim? And so often that's no. And I really like something that I heard Sarah Scholes say in an interview. She's a science journalist that got interested in this story when it broke in the New York Times, and she wrote a book about it. They're already here. And she said in an interview something to the effect of that she read that New York Times piece and she just went point by point trying to discover evidence to support or refute each point. And I thought that was such a great way to articulate it, that we don't have to know what they're trying to do. We don't have to know what their motives are. We could argue hearsay all day, but point by point, can we support or refute what they're claiming? And that so often leaves just an altogether different picture than the fantastic stories that get so much hype.
And yeah, you're right. That is a really great way of looking at things. And, for me, when you look at to throw Skinwalker Ranch back in there, but you look at, Eric Davis saying that there was a great portal that opened up and this, creature came out of it, or, you hear other things from people that were involved with NIDS, but yet there's nothing to substantiate that. I think that's really important. And then you hear John Alexander and co. talking about, or Kelleher talking about the security cameras and how the wires were mysteriously cut, especially Knapp. Knapp likes to promote a lot of stuff that can't be validated. But, you hear this type of thing. And then, like I went up and interviewed Junior Hicks, and Junior Hicks said, they asked me to come fix that, and the wires were cut by a human.
Yeah, I'd been meaning to ask you about that because I picked up on that in one of your other shows that you had said you had interviewed him, and I heard you, I think, a week or two ago say you'd be revisiting that interview. And it's so intriguing and so telling that Mr. Hicks is so often held up as a figure in support of the paranormal phenomena leanings, yet we collectively tend to leave that testimony out. We just kind of overlook that part. And similar with Jacques Vallée, that he's so championed as someone that had interesting and cutting edge ideas, and he did such interesting interviews and books. And as warranted as all of that, all of that praise may be, it's still kind of intriguing to me that so often his work about the intelligence community and deception and the flim-flammery going on just kind of gets bypassed. It doesn't get the same billing. And that's really interesting about, I mean, on record, you've got Hicks saying somebody disabled the cameras, I mean, there you go.
Yeah, and I just think it's so funny because when we talked to Junior, over the years, I've had several conversations with him and several visits, and it was interesting because he understood. I don't think he really liked Bigelow at all. And, he told me in actually more than one conversation that Bigelow had, the family, the Shermans, had Gwen Sherman fired from the bank in Roosevelt, Utah. So, and he could put the screws to the family and get, them to move back to the ranch and keep the cover story going. And so, there was this aspect, and I think that it's just he knew that he could see what Bigelow was about. He had questions about some of the new goings-ons, but unfortunately, because there was so much, people wanted to get to him, and people gave him disinformation. That, like we'd have a conversation and he'd talk about the fact that one scientist was telling him, if you see your compass spinning in one direction, then run, because that means a portal is opening up. And, there are specific times over the ranch when these types of things happen. And also then there was the fact that they had the rods that Mr. Sherman had found, and Junior felt that was element, there was element 115 involved and different things. So he was just as susceptible as we all are to some of these things, because you have really nice people that surround you and want to give you things or make you feel special. And unfortunately, it's such a slippery, nasty community of people that do have intelligence backgrounds and that know how to be nice and know how to manipulate the narrative.
Yeah, and as I've listened to you describing that, and as I've listened to your past shows, one of the things that comes to mind is so often with these stories, they're kind of ambiguous, and we're not really sure when or where something happened, and, there's just a lot of dots that are loosely connected, where with the Skinwalker situation, we have a lot of documentation of things that should raise eyebrows, and all combined with, as we've been saying, a lack of verification that anything particularly unusual was going on other than a bunch of stories. And one of the things that stood out to me was what I read and heard in your interviews with Chris Marks about that they were given Hunt for the Skinwalker to read. Like that's one of their first things to do before they go work on this property. And that's something that we can put an actual date on. It's ambiguous, or I mean, it's unambiguous. It's this happened at this time, and like at best, that shows incompetence unless the study was to see like what that leads people to think. Like there's a lot of questions to be answered about what your study was trying to what its objective was, what it was trying to accomplish, if that was part of the methodology.
Absolutely, and that is such a great point. I mean, why, if they were doing an objective scientific study of UAP, would they be priming the people that they're putting in their little hamster cage?
Yeah. I'm kind of jumping subjects, sort of, but it's sort of the same thing. To revisit the NICAP thing for a moment, there's a CIA memo that indicates that in 1965, they sent agents, officers, CIA officers who identified themselves as such and talked to Richard Hall and discussed NICAP operations with him, and Richard Hall was always forthcoming about this. I don't want to imply otherwise. And so, like, one of the things that's kind of interesting about that, we see that there was a CIA interest. Now, we could discuss what it may have been about, and that's a worthy discussion. But what it also brings up is, did the officers that went and talked to Hall, were they aware they had a CIA asset on the board of directors at the time? Like, like who saw the box lid, mm-hmm. and who was pulling these levers, and what was the point? There's just a lot of questions there about, couldn't you just ask the director? Or maybe they did interview the director and wanted to see how it compared to what Hall would say. And I think there's just a lot of interesting questions in that saga, in Skinwalker, in TTSA. Anytime you get professional intelligence personnel that are clearly interested in this, that this is an increasing priority, to that there are subjects of interest that they are filing reports about, it's reasonable to ask what the motives and intentions are. And all too often, as you're suggesting, Erica, here in the UFO community, we tend to think, oh, well, that means we're getting close, and that's not necessarily what it means at all. I mean, there's a lot of reasons that the FBI and the CIA might be interested in what a bunch of UFO investigators are learning about things flying around in the sky, and who their contacts are, and who's mm-hmm. giving them the information, and who's showing interest in it. There's a lot of reasons for that. And as you and James Carrion discussed, I certainly don't think that the going explanation for grants apparently given in relation pertaining to Skinwalker Ranch by the federal government and intelligence agencies, it's hard to think that their priority was peeking through alleged vortexes and whatnot.
You're right. I mean, and like I was saying at the beginning of the show, it's like the more I sit back and I have, my reality slap me on the cheek, over and over again, the more I'm just like, I can't believe I believed that. I mean, I'm in shock that I was that gullible to think that these things were happening in this one section of land that is unique. And like I was saying, when there are airlines, you can see planes flying over, and you can see, all of these, it just, none of it makes any sense. It's ridiculous. And I'm sure that the people that created this story and many other stories that have been inserted into the community, that they just sit back and laugh at how gullible people are.
What I think added to that was the ways it was presented. I can say personally, I remember sitting out in the car late at night, flipping on the radio, listening to Art Bell, and hearing, the spooky music and the interviews, and, more on Skinwalker after the break. And part of the credibility of it was we weren't as tainted yet about media, or at least I wasn't, gullible as that may have very well been. There was a certain feeling I had that, like, well, this is on the radio, man. This isn't something I'm reading in the National Enquirer or hearing only at a UFO conference. This is like on the radio by guys that say they're journalists. Mm-hmm. And then a journalist had a book about it, and he's got a real job at a real TV station. And it gave it more credibility. And then, we got a colonel with the NSA over here telling us these stories.
Right.
And that gets argued as to whether that gives it credibility or whether that detracts its credibility now. But there was a time that we gave it a lot of perhaps undeserved attention. And, going back to Sarah Scholes' wise suggestion of looking for evidence to support or refute those claims is the key. And as I was saying earlier too, of all people, a colonel that's an NSA and CIA consultant should know the importance of presenting evidence when he comes across with just fantastic claims.
Absolutely. And we have a question from chat, and they wanted to know why Kehoe got fired.
My understanding at this point, and that's one that's a debate. There's a certain group of people that think that Major Kehoe was axed and, as some put it, kicked upstairs to the Board of Governors and out of the director's chair. They think it was part of the CIA takedown, and that CIA wanted NICAP to cool its heels. There are others that feel that Kehoe had kind of reached a stalemate, and that his work with NICAP had become primarily personal arguments with the Air Force and personal grudges, and that the entire focus had become arguing about an alleged or purported, and to some extent correct, cover-up, and that the group and Kehoe may have lost focus on just investigating UFO reports and publishing what they were learning. There's significant evidence that NICAP was poorly operated from a business perspective, and even it's my understanding that even people that volunteered with NICAP and the investigators and people that were quite supportive of it would not argue that perhaps they and Major Kehoe were not the best business personnel, and in a manner of speaking, don't apologize for that either, because they really didn't feel like that was their primary focus, and they felt like what they were accomplishing was valid. So I don't really have an answer for that, but I can tell you that it's a valid criticism that the finances of the organization were perpetually in trouble, and they almost never got out their commitments, their newsletters and their magazines and journals on time, which was the whole point of being a subscriber. That was what you got for your money. And that often ran them into trouble, because it would even come time for the subscriptions to re-up when they hadn't delivered on what they had committed the previous description. And it was a difficult system to manage, because the subscriptions weren't prorated. They didn't all come due at one time. It was whenever you joined, you just paid your annual or however long you were subscribing for. So it was literally like any given day, you could have had revolving subscriptions. And it was a bear. It in a way got bigger than they were able to handle. I think Richard Hall even wrote at one point they were a victim of their own success, and that was correct to a certain extent. But we don't really know why Kehoe was kicked upstairs, as they put it, but there's some valid evidence and valid criticism that it wasn't a functional organization.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. I remember Gordon telling me, stories about finding checks that were coming into NICAP, behind a piano or different things that he wasn't really on top of things in that regard. But then again, at the end of the day, it's like, what was the organization? What was their true purpose? Was it to collect information, to look at the different sightings reports coming in, and perhaps to kind of get those in check, which I think they're doing now because there's some military testing taking place. Are they are creating psychological profiles on people that are submitting their reports, which we see that MUFON it does, it's like you think you've had an experience. Here, fill out this abductee questionnaire. That's great. We'll just get every bit of information out of you, and we'll have that, but thank you. And then we'll sell it to Bigelow and then we'll give it to, a person A, B, C, and D. There's so many reasons why this would be such an interesting and an important subject for the intelligence community to be enmeshed with.
Yeah, there's a lot of data, a lot of information that doesn't necessarily have to even have anything to do with UFOs or paranormal experiences, that shows how people behave and how they think. And there's some implications of that over the years, in stories like the Mothman saga and things like that. And if nothing else, NICAP gives us a classic example of getting so wrapped up in our passion that it can, become a breathless fever pitch, and we might allow other aspects of our lives to suffer, personal relationships, business commitments, the way we manage and organize other aspects of our life. And there's certainly some of that in here. Morris Jessup was an original founding person. He was at least at the original planning stages, and he attended a saucer group that was the springboard for NICAP, and he's the same guy that was involved in the Allende papers and the Philadelphia experiment. He launched that story, and tragically took his own life in 1959. I think, my personal opinion, there's a lot of conspiracies around it, of course, but this can be a pretty unforgiving topic, and he wouldn't have been the first or the last that became disillusioned with a mystery that just refused to bear answers, and actions of people that he was writing about and in investigating and interacting with that were just inexplicable. And sometimes we're just left to maybe never know why they did the things they did.
Well, it is so interesting too, and you look at Benowitz, and you look at some other people that have been completely manipulated, and I think that they're definitely people that are still alive and involved in the UFO community. That I don't know how they could maybe feel good about themselves at the end of the day, but I think these are lessons that we need to really take to heart, because this is happening, and people are being hurt, and people are suffering, and whether, Morris Jessup was on the right track or not, who knows, but it does attract people that are vulnerable.
Yeah, it sure does. And I mean, regressive hypnosis, need we say more? There's reasons for research protocols, and there's reasons for ethical standards, and among those reasons is to protect the integrity of the information, but it's also to protect the well-being of the research subject and the people and the witnesses and the people that are interviewed. And it just kind of depends on who we are as to whether we start using some of the extreme behavior as signposts to warn us about it, or if we get so indoctrinated in it that we're just going to keep trying to rationalize it at all costs. It's one of my observations.
Oh, no, it's so interesting and heartbreaking that so many people can, when we have personal experiences, we want answers. And so, we turn to the UFO community, and then unfortunately, because there are people that are mentally ill, people that are gullible, and then you've got the intelligence community, and so you're never getting any bit of the truth. You're just being whipped around and abused, and I think that's really, I hope it's time that we all start standing up against that kind of stuff, because it's gone on, for decades. and yet people are just, it's like they'll go to conferences and walk by a group of people who are being hypnotized by Lord knows who, and Lord knows where the information is going. And it's just like, oh my gosh, I look back at things that I've seen at conferences or experienced in other areas, and I am a little mortified, to say the least.
Yeah. I certainly can relate to that. It's standards of evidence. We could do a whole podcast and then some on, and how we interpret things and what we think they mean, and whether those interpretations are subjective or not, is something that really shouldn't be an argument. Like, we should be able to agree on what a fact is, and that's not always the case around the UFO conferences.
No, it in fact, some of the conferences I've been to, I just sat there with my mouth hanging open, because it's very clearly some of these groups that are organizing them are very vested in, like, the QAnon ideology, which is just insane. And you've got, people that are invested in a lot of kind of that are Nazi sympathizers. Let's just be straightforward about that. And I wanted to just mention something before I went to break. But NICAP, when they dissolved, they sold their email list to a person up in Canada, and I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but he was a Nazi sympathizer. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. I don't have the details of that off the top of my head and the tip of my tongue either, but I do know I did come across that story. I'm not sure if it was a particular intention of the sellers as much as the buyer was available, and they were just just didn't care if they got a couple bucks in their pockets, if it went to a right-wing organization or anyone, an extremist organization or anyone else. I really haven't decided, and I don't know enough about it to know if it was like intended to be funneled to this guy or if he just asked for it and they didn't discriminate against anybody that would give him a few bucks. And then most of the stuff, as I understand it, went to Kufos, but that was one of the sticking points. The way it became known was people on the subscription list and all were complaining that they were, which, is almost comical in a really dark way, that somehow, you want to learn more about UFOs and you start receiving Nazi propaganda in the mail.
Well, I would say that there's an interesting connection with that kind of propaganda and the UFO community. And that's why, to me, I've been raising a lot of alarm bells about QAnon, because you see a lot of that type of the same types of rhetoric put forward. And unfortunately, in the UFO community, decade after decade, you see some very extreme political ideologies, religious leanings, and extremist viewpoints on a lot of things that truly have nothing to do with the study of the phenomenon. And I think that is important. And I have to say, I would probably lean towards, even though I need more facts on the matter, that was, the list was sold on purpose with something deliberate in mind. And then, what are your thoughts before we get a break? I know this is a heavy one, but what are your thoughts about some of the about some of the overtly racist things that we see in ufology, and let's take the tall blondes with the blue eyes, who are the good, benevolent beings, space beings here to save the Earth, and somebody, what are your thoughts? Do you think there's anything darker in that ideology?
Well, like with the story about that, the guy in Canada just happens to end up with the mailing list. Like, were there connections there already? Even if it was an indiscriminate sale, why was it indiscriminate to him? Yeah, I think you've got a reasonable point there. And it takes you all of about 3 minutes looking around on Facebook to see just some of the absolutely insane far-right rhetoric coming from UFO investigators and their circles and family members, spouses, and whatnot. So it sure fits well. I'm not really qualified to give an opinion. I know some people like Jason Colavito and others, Jeb Card. They have gone quite a bit into the racism and Nazism that's just rather profound by their explanations in the UFO culture. The whole thing of suggesting that ancient civilizations didn't have enough sense to stack rocks on top of each other and would have needed, alien intervention in order to achieve some of their accomplishments, I know is a pretty big sticking point in the academic community. I'm not real red on any of that. I just generally accept that if that's the academic point of view, I think that they're probably correct. And as you're suggesting, it wouldn't just be coincidence that these bringers of light and love and all that is good and ultimate knowledge look like a perfect white race of people.
Absolutely. And it's like, how many times do we have to learn from history? But I guess clearly it's not quite sinking in for some people. But I want to just respond to Peter, who's in the chat room. And hello, Peter. I always love your questions and your support, and thank you for your kind email. But he just mentioned that at Skinwalker, Chris Marks was asked to read, before he went there, he was put into Bigelow's library and was asked to read a Nazi U-boat report about an expedition to a lost underwater city. Which Chris is here, and actually, I mean, of course he's here, he's my right-hand man here, but we're going to, next to Mario. Mario's first. But, I mean, he was asked to, and I'll get his clarification and clarify that on break, but he was asked to read Nazi literature.
Wow.
And transcribe it.
Wow.
So, okay, Chris, why don't you come in here and weigh in before we go to break? Because that is what I remember you saying, and I think Peter does too. So what were you asked to transcribe for Bigelow?
Okay, I was given a set of orders that were about 2.5 inches thick. They appeared to be original. They were from around 1942, came from the bunker in Berlin, and showed an expedition. If that ever took place or not, I do not know. But since my native tongue is German, I was asked to translate the orders as identical or as authentic as I could, given the language, given all of that. It took me a while. It took me about 10 days. So I read it in order to translate it. But it appeared to me it was more of a scientific approach to learn what was in those documents rather than a political statement. It simply was a excursion of a U-boat fleet to find the sunken city of Agatha. If that exists or not, I do not know. But they were very detailed. They had bills of ladings, crew members, the U-boat numbers, water depth, ice depth, current speed, water temperatures. It was probably one of the most complete warnos I've ever seen in my life. And so I translated them, but I don't want to put a rating on it. It may have been simply scientific, so I do not know.
Right, and thank you for weighing in. I think it is important to note, though, when you look at the UFO subject and you look at some of the people that are promoting finding the lost city and doing A, B, C, and D and things, that there are some interesting connections with the political realm and the Nazis and different things, and we can talk about that. There's so much more, but there's so much meat to this subject, and I think that's the unfortunate thing for those of us who are looking to actually study something remarkable, because you have to wade through all of this, and you've got but that's fascinating too. I'm having fun looking through all of this, but the connections and some of the motivations behind the scenes are just truly staggering to me. How do you feel, Jack?
Yeah, absolutely. And I understand what Chris is saying, that it could certainly be interpreted that the interest was on the excursion and they found it and it just happened to be Nazi material or have that kind of implication. But I also understand what you're saying, Erica, that like with the guy again in Canada, it just seems to often work out that way.
Yeah, and it's curious. It's something we should definitely be mindful of when we're studying this. And I'm Jack, I love having conversations with you. I love having you on my show because you teach people so many great things, and I appreciate that. And I want to just tell people to go to ufotrailblogspot.com, because there are great articles about all of the things that we're talking about tonight and much, much more. I would put that on your top list of like 2 or 3 blogs that you go to get valid information. We are going to take a quick break, and I'm excited to play for you guys a German band out of Germany. That was Deep Thoughts with Erica Lukes. So did you get the point that this is a German band? Yes, it is. It is a band that Chris actually was in a long, long time ago. And this band, Hunter, toured Europe and was a very prominent band. They have a new album that they just released, and it's called The Return. And so we've got a great signed copy here that they sent to Chris. It's really, really cool. They are very heavy rockers, and we wish them all the best, and I can't wait to get over there and see them. But we're going to play track 1. This is called Way to Nowhere, and then Jack and I will be back after this. I want to tell all of you who are listening tonight on Spreaker, get up there and push the follow button. Get the word out. Let's get the show going, especially on the new platform that I'm at. So we're going to take a break. Here is Hunter. All right, that was Hunter out of Germany. That was a band that my husband used to play with a long, long time ago. They have been incredibly successful, and they are rocking it out still to this day. So way to go, and thanks for letting us play that song. I loved it. Just got me all sorts of spicy. I'm telling you, which is a little scary for public safety, to be honest, but you know how that happens. So I am here with Jack Brewer, who is somebody that I really respect a great deal because he's asking the questions that all of us need to be asking. And that is, you know, if you're making claims, make sure you give us some evidence. Let's see it. And I think that it's been an interesting process for me and I've learned a great deal about all of these things. I don't take anything at face value anymore because there's so many games and deception, and there is a very big need to steer the narrative. But welcome back, Jack, and I want to tell everybody to go to ufotrail.blogspot.com to read your great blog. And also, just to say, I've got to go to UFOclassified.com and become a Patreon because I need all of your support. And I just released for all of my show supporters part of an interview with Junior Hicks. So go there and pledge your support for the show. But Jack, thank you so much for being here. And we've talked about so much, specifically, you know, all of the great stuff that you're learning with NICAP, which was really the biggest organization. It was the biggest organization that was collecting UFO reports in the United States in that pivotal time frame. And there were so many people involved in it that were in the intelligence community. And why that didn't raise alarm bells to anybody, I guess it's kind of like what we're seeing now. You know, now we've got this new disclosure that is being brought about by the same you know, I could use bad language here, but I won't. By the same people who've been promoting absolute garbage. And so, I mean, I guess the difference is NICAP had a lot more class. They were a lot more polished.
It's interesting. That's one of the things that I found intriguing about it, and thanks for the praise. I appreciate
Absolutely.
that. There's some criticism that's justified, and there's some praise that's justified. On the praise side, they don't have the 70 years of hindsight that we have now when they were trying to figure this out. And for so many investigators and researchers to be making the same mistakes is kind of questionable. Another thing that I think about with looking at this stuff is I'm often wondering how I sound to people when I say, you know, in 1958 or, you know, and then in 65, I can understand if somebody says, my God, this is, you know, like, didn't anything ever happen after 72, you know? And like you sound like a sports fan that just keeps screaming about Joe Namath or something, you know? And I think one of the reasons that happens, like James Carrion and his interest in the 1946, 1947 era, and that he tries to focus on that. I think one of the reasons that happens is it's there now for the analysis, where current events are fluent and they're changing and they're morphing before us. And we don't have as many opportunities oftentimes for FOIA and obtaining authentic documents with current events as we do some of the old things and the things that we now know in hindsight, like who some of the CIA operatives were that were involved with NICAP and some of the other things that were going on at the time that we're not able to put in context as they're happening in front of us, and that gives us some interesting things to look at, and there's a lot of rich history. I just happen to mostly come at it as my primary interest is the overlapping of the intelligence community with NICAP and the UFO community. Other people might find their UFO research particularly interesting. I'm kind of more like you and Lauren Cutts were talking about a couple weeks ago. I kind of got more interested in the social aspects because that's something more readily available for study. And when we say that they need to bring the evidence, I would like to emphasize that I'm talking about intelligence personnel and military people and researchers that proclaim things as fact. I'm not talking about individual citizens, people that have the courage to tell their stories at a UFO conference or to write books or blogs about their personal experiences. Those are just up for interpretation, and people are entitled to tell their stories if that's what they choose to do. They, of course, need to understand they're subject to criticism when they do that, and if they're entitled to tell their story, there's people that are entitled not to accept it as it's perceived. But particularly when I talk about that intelligence professionals need to bring the goods, that if you're putting yourself in a position to be interviewed by the media about what you claim you did in a professional capacity, and the vast majority of it is just talk, it's reasonable for us to ask why that is. And when you got ready to leave, didn't you have any idea that you might need some documents proving your employment? Or did you talk to any attorneys that specialize in whistleblower complaints? Or did you seek legal counsel at all? And why, if the primary objective is to bring credibility to the UFO topic and give it the objective and professional and scientific research that it's claimed to justify, why would your avenues for that be Fox News and a MUFON convention? I mean, like, isn't that what you do? I mean, I'm not even being sarcastic. Like, what would it look like if you wanted to make fun of it? Mm-hmm. How would it look different than that?
Oh, it's just all, yeah. This whole thing is just so interesting, and I really want to ask you, because I know you wrote an article, and that this has been something that has been very important to me as of late because of some of the discoveries that I am making and the connections. And I want to talk a little bit about a blog that you wrote back April 2nd, 2014 about the Ambient Monitoring Project. Can you give our listeners a little bit of background on that?
Yes, I remember that blog post real well. That was something that a friend of mine and I worked on quite a bit. Isabella Melamed helped me a great deal with the research for that, as did some other people, and I wrote about that. It was a project that was called the AMP, the AMP. It was originally the Abduction Monitoring Project and was later changed to Ambient because the story anyway was that they thought they would have a better chance to get serious researchers and qualified scientists to take a look at it if they changed the name from Abduction. And the AMP was the brainchild of some UFO investigators. Tom Dooley kind of became the spokesperson and front man for it. And some other people that apparently had ties with MUFON and the Fund for UFO Research and various organizations at that time. It was supposed to put boxes in the homes of self-described experiencers, alien abductees, if you will, that reported multiple abductions, multiple experiences. And the general idea was to monitor the ambient environment through these boxes, and for the abductees, the people that lived there, at the same time to keep a journal, and later scientists would look through the data and compare it to the journal and see what, if anything, had taken place in the environment, temperatures, light, things like this during the reported experiences. Tom Dooley wrote an article about that and left a lot of questions unanswered in it. They never really did explain who funded it. I did catch on your show that James Carrion mentioned that it was, he believed, a wealthy individual funded it that did not want to be known. I can imagine that could be the case. That's certainly not unusual in the nonprofit industry, that someone funds something that doesn't want a lot of unsolicited requests for more donations. I just felt like that Tom Dooley could have explained that better than he did. Another problem I have with the organizations at that time, MUFON, FUFOR, KUFOS, there were a few, that they would refer to each other as MUFON or FUFOR when it was really appeared to be a pretty closely knit group of men that were all in touch with each other on a regular basis, and many of them sat on the boards of directors of the same organizations. If not at that exact point in time in the late 1990s and into 2000, if not at that exact point in time, certainly at other times. So it kind of felt to me like they're saying that a proposal was presented to the Fund for UFO Research gave it a certain legitimacy that may have not been entirely warranted. But where the wheels really fell off the project, Erica, was somewhere around, I think, 2006 or so. Between there and 2010, it was pretty much time for it to all come due. And it was an impressively presented project. This gave some of that so cherished data, this information we want to know, something to sink our teeth into, that we so hunger and thirst for on these UFO forums and in these conference meetings and the regional meetings, that it stirred up a lot of interest. And then they never presented the results. They evaded questions, they being Tom Dooley, MUFON board members. They evaded questions about what became of the data, about why they could or could not give it to other people that would be willing to fund having it completed. There were problems about they couldn't answer with any authority or reliability how many volunteers were involved. They couldn't answer who the project personnel were. They refused to answer that. There was some talk about one statistician, I believe he was, in the Southwest that he's mentioned in the blog post. But it was really a dark day for the research community and MUFON, that there were so many conflicting explanations about what happened with the project and who was running it and where the money came from. And the bottom line, they just never gave an explanation for what happened. And my digging around, I did come across people, one who claimed to be in it, and that person was quite disillusioned with never being given any information about what the data said about them, and that they claimed to have had an experience during the experimental time. And I could go a lot of directions with this, a lot of suspicions, a lot of concerns about the lack of transparency.
Yes.
I could also say that at absolute best, if nothing was learned, then that's information. Like if it didn't support that something was physically happening to people when they claimed it was, that in itself should be information that's made public. And if it's concealed because it's not good for business of UFO organizations that rely on the public belief in aliens, that would be an issue in itself. But that's among like the best parts that I see in this story.
You know, and it's been interesting because my research just leads me down to down all sorts of paths, and this, as I look at the abduction phenomenon when this first came into play, the late 60s, Betty Barney Hill, and then you look at abductions, and then you look at what the CIA and some of these people involved were working on. You've got Jose Delgado, who was working on these chips to control people's behavior, and that was going way, way back. You look at some of the needs to use hypnosis to create super soldiers or to control the masses again. I mean, you've got all of these things, and when you step back and look at what their projects were that we know about, there's so many things we don't know about, and then you look at the progression of ufology and the folklore involved in it, you have to step back and wonder, okay, is the UFO issue just a cover for some of the things that they were doing behind the scenes? And I look at the AMP project, and I am questioning some of the people involved with this, and I have one person here in Phil in the web chat room who's saying, go to the NICAP page and look up the A-Team, and you do see the same types of people. Tom Dooley was with the NSA. You look at Mark Rodiger, and then you look at the AMP project and the fact that they were told when the investigators were told before they go into the home of the experiencer, abductee, whatever we're going to call them, so we can feel better about being taken from your home and whatever. But, you've got the investigator was supposed to turn the switch on to activate the device before it was put in the home. They were supposed to do that without the knowledge of the participant in this. And there was also an additional phone line, a landline that was hooked up with regard to this project. And then you've got the fact that there are, it very clearly says that, scientists will be looking at the data, but we're not going to give you the name of the scientists. And I find that very disturbing.
Yeah, there were a lot of problems with it. I talked to people that were supposed to be involved in the project, and as I explained in the blog post, some of the statements were just increasingly concerning about how much these volunteers were talked to and by who and under what conditions. And we're going to kind of get back to where we started on this, about if you're a former NSA assignee, which Tom Dooley is. And we can talk more about that shortly. And you're working on something that your signals intelligence expertise allows you to understand how to do. And several of these men sit on several boards of directors of UFO organizations and have backgrounds in the intelligence community and ties to the intelligence community. I do not understand how they could not understand that it's so important to follow through on things that you say you're going to do, and that transparency is so key. Because again, what would this look like if you were trying to stir up a conspiracy theory? How would it look different if you were trying to alarm people? And I just don't understand how. I mean, this is the very thing that causes conspiracies, for people to look incompetent at a dumbfounding level, just a dumbfounding level, that they didn't have the money to complete the project and went on with it for some 10 years, and including giving the data to someone for analysis while then purportedly not having the money to complete it. I don't even understand how you don't have a better lie than that. Like, that's even an incompetent lie, you know?
But then there are people that are believing that. You know, maybe are people that are just assuming that because they're saying, "Oh, the funding ran out, that nothing happened." So please elaborate on that and what you've learned.
It depended on who you asked, and the longer it went on, the less of them would even return emails. Some of them were trying to explain it that just clearly didn't know what they were talking about, and like Clifford Cliff. And over the course of, I'd have to look at the blog post to remember exactly, but over the course of a few months, the amount they claimed they needed to increase or to complete the data analysis increased like, I don't know, like $50,000 or something. It like went from like $5,000 to $50,000 they claimed they needed. And then when people were even offering to buy the data or pay to get the data or pay to have it done, you know, people wanted to work out fundraisers or something, they didn't want to do that either. And they just were not forthcoming with reasonable questions about what took place and why they were just scrapping this project after you had done every part of it but report what happened.
Yeah, and this is really interesting. I have a question from someone in chat. But what did you talk to Kathleen Martin about the project?
No, I did not. To the best of my knowledge, she wasn't involved in it.
Okay. You know, and it is interesting just to note all of these things, and it is alarming to me when I have been digging into this and some of the very interesting questions that are asked and things. I mean, you have a separate phone line, a landline that is being established. You've got a box of, you know, Lord knows what is in that box and where the data is going at the end of the day, and you're virtually giving up your rights as a witness because you're looking for answers, and you're putting faith in people that aren't being named. And, you know, you look at the fact that these people are involved in the intelligence community. I mean, to me, that just reeks. It reeks. And I think that we need to look a little bit further. I certainly am looking a little bit further into this, the ambient monitoring project.
And I'll just say again, you know, piggybacking what you just said, given that's the case, I don't understand when it's reasonable for people to have to express what you just did, why you wouldn't overcompensate for that if you're a former NSA employee that's working on several boards of directors and launching new organizations like the Fund for UFO Research and whatnot. And it would just be like step one to make sure that you explain what you're doing and that it's clear to everybody. At best, it just shows a brazen lack of concern of how your work is assessed by the community at large. And that's insulting to people that support the organizations and that just want to know what's going on. It's insulting to people that respect professional research protocols and that try to adhere to them themselves. The box you were talking about, in Dooley's article in the MUFON Journal, he did explain what was purportedly in the box and how it gathered ambient data. However, that was part of the point of the landline, and the extra line was the volunteer was never to open the box or to mess with the box in any way, and it was somewhat camouflaged as a normal household item for what were supposedly a few reasons. I guess one would be to, be less disturbing to visitors to the home or whatever, and ostensibly so that the aliens wouldn't know that you're under surveillance, that they're getting nabbed in the act.
Okay, and I'm sorry you say that, and I'm just thinking about how, honestly, that sounds
I know.
Absurd.
You need to pick your teeth up, right? I know.
Seriously, okay, we've got this advanced, civilization coming here from outer space, and yet, we're gonna pull one over on them by,
Yeah. Dooley's gonna pull one over on them with jewelry box. Yeah.
That's a good one.
Yeah, and so then this extra phone line was to be a really secure connection to the data collection base, which I think was more or less Dooley's home. And if there was any disconnect, any problems, any box opening, anything, it would alert. And from what I understand, they claim that never took place with any of the volunteers. But like I say, it's really not clear how many people they got to do it, or the number was low at best. And it's just not clear what all took place. And I did find some documents that are linked in the blog post of the journal of one person that claimed that they had an experience, and they described the experience and the date and everything, but then they just never tell us if the any data, any changes in anything seemed interesting or not.
Well, that is interesting. And you look at, again, it's like I look at the people involved, look at their connections to the intelligence community, look at their religious, thoughts and things and political leanings. And then you look at their character and what they've been doing with data over the years. And then for me, like looking at MK Ultra has been a very eye-opening thing, because you're looking at, they were the intelligence community, the CIA was giving different universities and groups money to research things. Some of them had no clue what it was about, but they were part of it. They were getting funding, and so they would do these things on the behest of Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, who was just a real sick and twisted individual, but the ultimate goal was to control and to create the super soldier, different things, and see how you could break the human spirit, or get a confession out of somebody, or all of these things. And I look at the parallels between, here you've got Gottlieb, you've got Putoff, you've got Kit Green, you've got people, Bigelow, who gave funding, if I'm not mistaken, to some of these groups that you're mentioning, and bought the data, and was also interested in things like that, specifically at Skinwalker Ranch, with the response, the physical response, the emotional response to stimuli. And Chris had things he was talking about at Skinwalker Ranch that were brought to the ranch that were similar, as did other colleagues of his. Could that have been used? What was truly in it? You can't really, at this point, I would say, you have to question Dooley's motivations and things. And so it's just really, it is curious to me, and I really truly feel that it has nothing to do with alien abductions.
Yeah, I can certainly understand that point of view. And at best we could say, even if it does, there's certainly a faction of people that have gone in a really odd direction with it. And all of these links, these dots, you do keep coming back to the same people. There are some implications about Bigelow and the Fund for UFO Research and the Ambient Monitoring Project saga. And I mentioned when we started the story, I'd come back to that about Dooley and being an NSA employee. And that I need to emphasize, that doesn't make someone, a villain. I mean, there's, just my disclaimer here. There's a lot of national security employees in that industry with the intelligence community that do good work, that should be proud of what they do. And it doesn't make anything necessarily suspicious that any of those people also have an interest in the UFO community. But like we've said, it would seem like that being the case, you'd understand that carries a little baggage with it, as compared to, say, people like you and me, Erica. And one of the stories of interest, it all connects. Gather around, kids, and Grandpa will tell you another story from 1912 here.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But the NICAP story, one of the, outspoken people as NICAP fell apart was Todd Zekel. And he and the guys at the Citizens Against UFO Secrecy, a group called CAUSE. There was a group that did a lot of pioneer work on the FOIA with UFOs, and suing the CIA and suing the NSA. And one of the things that came out of this was, a lot of things. There was more than one lawsuit, and whatever these documents may or may not ultimately indicate, they did a lot of work on it. And I will kind of digress here for a moment and tell people that if you go to my blog, the UFO Trail, a recent blog post was about that, how to obtain all of the UFO documents from the CIA that they have on a compact disc for $10. You can get them. And they told me that after an FOIA request I had on Stuart Nixon from NICAP. They gave me what I asked for, and then it's kind of amusing. They also said, like, as if they know where this is headed, by the way, here's everything we got for $10 if you want it. So I did go ahead and order it. I haven't received it yet, but some people might be interested in at least looking at that blog post. But that's something that came out of it, is out of the lawsuits, is all these documents. But something else that happened was during a disposition of a man named Yeats in the 70s, when he was an NSA man that was explaining what could be and couldn't be released by the NSA in one of these lawsuits for UFO documents. He mentioned a document that wouldn't be included because it was about someone's attendance at a UFO event and not actually about UFOs. So when I noticed that, I FOIA'd it to the NSA and asked if they'd be willing to review it and release it now, and they did. And as skeptics had noted in the past, Phil Klass had kind of figured this out back in the day as well. This was a memo written by Tom Dooley about the 1978 MUFON symposium that he attended, and he advised his NSA superiors about some events that happened in it. And it doesn't actually state it's Dooley, but due to information in it, we're 99% certain that it is Dooley, because he lists the event. He lists in real life, outside the FOIA, for lack of a better term, he was at this 1978 symposium in Dayton, and he has said to the community that he was NSA and that he informed his superiors that he was attending it and that kind of thing. So it's pretty conclusively put together. And so, yeah, it is interesting. The contents of this are about, he's thinking that Zekel and his colleagues are up to some shenanigans. And of course, Zekel and the bunch want to know if Dooley knows anything about UFOs, since he works for the NSA, and there's a number of subplots going on, but one of them is certainly that here we have this line all the way from NICAP to Zekel to Tom Dooley's memo in 1978, and then, here we are, lo and behold, well into the 21st century, when that's who set up the monitoring boxes in the homes of volunteers for a project that never came to fruition, at least as they tell the story.
And that is fascinating, and definitely something that I will be looking into, because the connections here and the fact that none of these people have given anything of substance, but they're taking and getting data and of confusing the subject and all of these things. I just think that's really important. There's something is definitely rotten in Denmark or the United States, wherever. But we need to look into this. This is important. And I've got a question here from Scott Brown, and I want to just ask this. And I want to give Scott a load of thanks, because he does beautiful graphics for my show every week. And thank you, Scott, for everything. But he wants to ask you, referring to your latest blog, do you put total trust in the CIA and other government agencies to be completely transparent with their assistance?
Oh, goodness, no. I think that the FOIA is a really good thing. However, it can be adhered to perfectly, as my understanding of how it's written, and they still not disclose everything to you or everything that you're looking for. Like the example we just gave of, they didn't include that memo about a MUFON conference in a release of documents about UFOs, because it wasn't literally about something flying in the sky. So I would say definitely keep FOIAing, just because the agency says here's everything we've got. They're not required to even acknowledge the existence of a classified document. So it's kind of dysfunctional in a way that like if I ask for any documents pertaining to person A, it's kind of dysfunctional that they could say we don't have anything, but check back once a year forever, because then they might say, well, we decided to declassify it, because they're not required to say we have something that's not available for release. So no, I don't think that the FOIA is like the be all end all, but I think it's a great research tool.
It is, and it's yeah, it's interesting. I've done some FOIA requests for different cases I was working on, and I have a feeling I'm going to be doing a few more. But with regard to all of this and the fact that you see the same people, the same good old boys club who've been involved in this decade after decade, I mean, what are your thoughts now on why was NICAP established? What was truly the goal behind that? Why was MUFON established? And whatever came from the 50 plus years of MUFON getting funding, getting good people to donate money to do their bidding?
I think that anytime we have more than really one person, much less more than two or three, but when we get into half a dozen, 10, 15 people are involved in a project, we could even say this about TTSA, in my opinion, there's multiple agendas. There's layers of reasons they're involved, and they all have personal interest as well as a mutual interest, and that mutual interest might be to get visibility for the group, to get funding for the group. It might even have something to do with post-credible information about UFOs, but so often it seems that that's really just a byproduct of something that people are personally interested in achieving, and don't really necessarily care how well the organization does. That the mutual interest is not as important to them as their individual interests. It's just necessary in order to keep the ship afloat at all. And I can't necessarily say that so about NICAP or MUFON or TTSA, but I think it's a pretty good rule of thumb. And I am looking, like we've been talking about, specifically at how NICAP was formed, and these groups almost take on a mind of their own, that there was a saucer club that a few people attended, and then they took up a collection and they launched it, and the original 3 people that were involved in that didn't even end up on the board of governors. And then there's some governors that were at some of the original meetings, but they kind of take off in a different direction. And then there's some kind of shady figures that just kind of hung around for a month or two. And when people started asking what's going on with the money in the till, a whole slew of them just said, okay, we're out of here. And there seem to be a lot of layered agendas. And then somehow there's this collective NICAP that just kind of keeps stumbling through from one decade to the next, at least for a while. And they always seem to be made up of a bunch of personal interests that come together into some kind of collective project that just kind of gets left to roam by itself as long as the personal interests keep getting met.
And it's really interesting. And I will say, knowing Gordon Lohr, who is helping me co-author a book that should be out probably at the beginning of next year. It's been a long process to update everything, but hearing his experiences with NICAP and knowing that he was an exceptional researcher, and knowing Ann Druffel and seeing everything that she did with NICAP that I have. I mean, those were people that were genuinely interested and very intelligent people. But then you look at the other people that were, that started the organization and that eventually disbanded the organization, and there are a lot of questions about that. And same thing with MUFON and APRO, certainly an interesting thing in and of itself. And I want to ask you your thoughts on TTSA. Should we really believe that this is truly disclosure?
I don't think that we should embrace and believe much of anything without evidence in proportion. Like, we'll go to Sarah Scholes one more time about just go point by point down the list and seek evidence to support or refute the claim. And from what I can tell, that 2017 article by Leslie Kean and her crew, we're going on 3 years now since that article hit the Times, and there is still a great deal of significant assertions in that article that have not been substantiated. And that, as Frank Warren described at the UFO Chronicles, he explained his interactions with trying to get to the bottom of it with Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal, that they won't specifically explain what led them to believe those assertions were correct. The story has moved somewhat. I mean, it's relatively interesting that TTSA got a contract with the Army. There's some FOIA work that's ongoing about that. But I pretty much came to decide that I'm really not too interested in many more statements or human interest articles in one magazine or another about any of these guys until I just get my hands on some FOIA releases and see what the DIA claims it funded, what they got in return, what the reports say. We get some more substantiation to this story. And I mean, pretty much, people can say anything, but can they actually back it up? And what Luis Elizondo and his colleagues may have liked to believe was going on, or may have thought was going on, or that they're kind of an ad hoc representative, more or less ad lib project that they kind of take responsibility for, which they may feel makes them the director. The fact of the matter is we have two Pentagon spokespersons telling us that Elizondo not only didn't direct that project as he claims, but he had no responsibilities in it. And these are discrepancies that can't just be shrugged off, right. Not if you respect the professional research process.
Absolutely.
There may certainly be explanations for them. There may certainly be things that we see in the FOIA material that makes it all make sense. But we're going to keep coming back to, shouldn't a person in that position understand that they need to bring the goods when they make a claim like that?
And they're not, and that's the thing. I mean, it's just it's when I look at the people involved, and you hear Chris Mellon and these people. talking and stuff, you just think, oh, give me a break. And why would we seriously trust people like Dr. Colm Keller, who's given us a big fat nothing? And then you've got the solicitation sheet for OSAP, where it very clearly has nothing to do with UFOs, but non-lethal weapons testing, RF, and do technologies and the effects on biological tissues and things like that. I mean, it's like, why would we ever give any of these people the time of day? And why is there such a fan club built up around people who I think are just charlatans? And to me, I mean, I've asked all of those people, I said, hey, if you want to come on my show, you can talk about some of this. But of course they're too busy doing Coast to Coast, which is, no comment. But it's just, I don't know, all of this just, it kind of infuriates me, because there's so many good people that are looking at this and they're thinking, oh, disclosure, we've worked so hard, we deserve this, the government is being truthful. No, they're not. These people involved are getting money. They've got defense contractors who are trying to work for funding. I think there are a lot of really nasty things going on behind the scenes, and we will never see disclosure. And for me, I don't want disclosure from these people, because I don't trust them. And I would never in a million years, if we did have, the little Eben over here who's communicating, or a little gray friend, hidden in Area 51, if these people were in charge of communicating for humanity, we are completely hosed.
Yeah, I hear you, Erica. And the TTSA has pretty effectively networked, and I mean, they do have people that came from high-profile defense industry jobs. They had a network of media people, and to their credit or not, depending on how you want to look at it, they seem to have used it pretty effectively. They seem to have used social media pretty effectively and gotten a following there that's loyal, and in my estimation appears larger than it may actually be, because it's loud. They make a lot of noise, but it doesn't seem to be a lot of people that are doing that, at least not like I think they had hoped they would have stirred up by this point. But we're just going to keep coming back to, why is that necessary if you have all of the stuff that you claimed you had all along that you still haven't presented? And one thing DeLong recently said that I copied and saved somewhere, because I thought, wow, I'll be coming back to that one. He even acknowledged it was just his opinion, and he said, no, I don't. In so many words, he said, I don't have any proof. It's just what I think. And it is like we've been talking about off and on tonight, Erica. It's an ongoing story. The whole genre is of people that get involved, that are real passionate, that are misguided, that get influenced by other people that may be misguided or have ulterior harmful motives. And sometimes even then will become too stubborn or too vested to rethink it, and will just double down. And Tom DeLong may be a classic example of that. We may never know what the motives were. And as we said too, I mean, that's why I'm looking at things that are decades old, so that they can be dissected a little more than, I mean, this is something that, years from now, historians will still be trying to sort out.
Absolutely. But I really feel right now, and I say this in a lot of my shows, this is really a critical time for the subject, because you have certain people with a lot of money, some people in the intelligence community, and other people that are from different countries that have money they want to throw at this for whatever reason, I'm not sure, but that they are sweeping up data. they're paying people to collect the data, to scan it, and to get it into places where most people will not have the ability to look at it. Therefore, this is their way for organizations like TTSA to rewrite the history of the subject and shape it in any way that they choose, which to me is very disturbing, because they are presenting a threat narrative. They're presenting a narrative that really takes personal power away from each of us who have had experiences. And I think that's a very dangerous thing. And so I really encourage people to look at the history, to listen to what I'm saying on my show, to listen to what Jack is saying on his incredible blog, to look at Keith Basterfield, to look at the people who are really digging into the subject and the people involved. And, because the history is disappearing right in front of our eyes. And, unfortunately, now we've got the new, I've mentioned this several times, the bright, shiny object like the Nimitz UFOs and Dave Fravor and blah, yada, yada, all this stuff. And at the end of the day, I would be willing to bet in 10 years that was just something that was being tested, that is our own technology, because, gosh, we certainly have a lot of stuff out there right now that is our own technology, but we, whatever. But so I think it's just critical, and it's critical to see, as you have pointed out so brilliantly, that there is a pattern here. Here we have in the 50s, 60s, the intelligence community saying that, oh, yes, we might get close to disclosure, but no, we're going to pull it away. And then you've got, this organization in the 70s and 80s, and here we are, almost disclosure, pull it away. And the intelligence community's always been involved. And then nothing has ever come out of that but more chaos and confusion. And this is really critical for us to not rest our hopes on disclosure, a fictitious disclosure. And I think we should really turn to our own, just like for me, when I look at my sightings, I will keep them personal to me. And I will really try hard not to let the outside world taint what my personal experience was. And I think that we should all do that a little bit more because of the games that we have seen and the patterns we've seen.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Way to bring it home, Erica.
Thank you. I just love talking to you, and I've gotten so much great feedback on the show tonight. You bring a lot of important topics to this. We need to be critical. We need to do research. And I definitely would I want to tell all of you, if you go to the UFO Trail, .blogspot.com, and then also look, there's a great article in here that I need to bring you back, Jack, to talk about the DIA No Docs on NIDS that you wrote in 2018. I would recommend Joseph Bryan III, the FBI, CIA, lots of great information there. And so thank you so much, Jack, for your great work and for being my friend and a respected colleague. It's been great to have you. So thank you.
Thank you, and you're welcome, and you and Chris have a great weekend.
We will. Thank you so much. And I want to just tell all of you listening, this has been a ride, and this is something that you are all there for. I appreciate all of you and your support and getting into chat and also supporting the show, because I want to keep archiving. It takes a lot of money and time. I want to keep the show on. And again, those are things that it's a full-time job and then some, but I am passionate about it, and I believe that this is a critical time. And so we need to support good people in the field. And I want to just again give a shout out to Scott Brown in the field. He does great work. Love him. I love my friends. And thank you so much for all of your support. We are going to get to the bottom of this. Good things are happening with Skinwalker, and you just watch over the next few months, because more bombshells are going to drop, and people that have been promoting this narrative and doing very harmful things to people in the community and people that I love, they will be exposed, and you can mark my words on that. Go to UFOclassified.com to hear more. Trust me, next week's show is going to be equally fascinating. So thank you, Jack. All of you have a great night. Make sure you hit the like button on Spreaker and spread the word. Take care, and we will catch you next week.